I'm pleased to introduce Jake Tawney, who will be speaking today on the state of the classical movement. Jake currently serves as the Chief Academic Officer of Great Hearts Academy in Phoenix, Arizona. He graduated with a degree in mathematics and computer science from Denison University and earned a master's degree in mathematics from the Ohio State University. So, proud alum. He submitted a thesis on the mathematics of juggling, which just delights me. He is taught at Upper Arlington High School, so just down the street, in the Pontifical College Josephinum, including courses in Euclid and the philosophy of mathematics. Jake is also the author of Another Sort of Mathematics, Selected Proofs Necessary to Acquire a True Education in Mathematics, and he has brought 5 or 6 copies, which are available for sale today, and he will even sign them for you. So I think a great deal. Get them while they're still here. All right. Please join me in welcoming Jake up for his talk. Thank you.
It is just so great to be here. I'm home, right? So I think at the very beginning, Lee said we all kind of came in from Arizona. It was a great flight in. My colleague Geraldine Olson's in the back. I do feel bad for her. I thought she might have to go to the hospital because on the way driving through, I might have hit her really hard saying, "There's the horseshoe! There's the horseshoe! Look, look, look!" Thank you for that kind introduction, Jonathan. As Jonathan said, Ohio is my home until about 10 years ago. I was born and raised in Northeast Ohio, where my parents still live with my brother. My sister's down here in Central Ohio in Johnstown. My wife and I raised 6 of our children, had 6 of our children, and started raising them in Delaware, Ohio. Just north of the city here. And then as Jonathan said, got my teaching start here at Upper Arlington. My good friend and mentor, Paul Kraft, is in the audience, gave me my first administrative job. And I still feel bad about that because I got to see Paul at sort of the prime of his leadership. Well, you're probably still at the prime of your leadership, Paul. And he got to see me as a very young, inexperienced administrator and saw all of my faults and errors and was very patient and kind with me. And so all this is to say that I'm delighted to be back. Now, they made me hold this microphone, which seemed better than the one that has a cord. I'm going to try really hard not to throw it at some point, right? This is the goal. I have a low bar for the presentation. So as long as I don't throw the microphone, we'll be in business. What I'd like to do today is really a couple things, right? I want to just very briefly sort of celebrate the success and the growth of classical education in the country, just by giving you a few numbers, some of the research that's been put out recently by Arcadia Education. But then I really want to talk about the future. I want to talk about the challenges that I think the movement is going to face as we make our way through the next 5 to 10 years. That's kind of my goal. However, the 2 things that I'm passionate about are going to be named as 2 of the challenges facing the movement, and that is the problem of recruiting and training and forming teachers, but then also really trying to get clear on the definition of classical education. So with your permission, there's this sort of structure about the challenges facing the movements, but really what I'm probably going to just do is speak passionately and rave about classical education, what it is and why it's so important for our country and for our kids. Sound good? We're good? All right, okay. In 1995, per sort of the Great Hearts research, we think there were about 3,000 students that were being classically educated. This is the research coming, again, I mentioned out of Arcadia Education from 2024. This doesn't have student numbers on it yet, but I was delighted by the number of schools because by the time we get to 2023-24, there are half as many schools as there were students in 1995. And so we've definitely seen this tremendous growth that seems to be, at least in the last 5 years, at about a 4.5% to 5%. And if you translate that to students, we've moved from 3,000 to just an astounding almost with 677,000 in 2024. If you update that, again, with a sort of a steady 4.5%, 5% growth, we're now bordering on 750,000. And that's amazing. Now, Arcadia has also then projected forward, assuming a lot of the growth patterns that they've seen in the various areas that are contributing to the classical movements, and looking at that 4.5%, 4.8%, 5% growth rate, they think that by the time we hit 2035, we're going to have close to 1.5 million students, which makes up about 2.5% of American kids. Now, with due respect to my friend and colleague Eric Twist, I am both optimistic and pessimistic about this number, right? I am optimistic in the sense that I actually think this number is low. I think it's based on continued patterns that we're seeing in the last 10 years or so, but I think that we're about to enter something that moves not just from a 4.8 multiplying effect, but we're going to start to see that rate go up. So I'm pretty optimistic about those numbers. Now, the reason I'm pessimistic about it, or maybe that's not quite the right word, is because as those numbers grow, we are going to start facing some challenges. And that really is sort of the core of the talk. What's going to happen as these numbers grow, right? Especially if 2.5% becomes 5%, becomes 10%. The first thing that we're going to note, and I think this is going to be an immediate challenge, and we're already seeing it, is that the number of school-age children is already declining. The colleges know this already, don't you? Right? It was 2025, I think, was that first year that we started to see a decrease, an actual decrease in the number of high school seniors coming out of high school programs and then matriculating onto college. And that's going to be a problem, right? I mean, there's a decrease in the market itself. But that's, of course, because we've already seen these problems in the K-12 world, because we've already seen these problems with the birth rates, right? So this is based off live birth data, so it's not quite a one-to-one with school enrollment, but the reason I liked it is that I could actually get after just kindergarten enrollment. As we move from 2005 all the way through 2029, just based on CDC live birth data, which I recognize is not the same as enrollment, there's a trend here that's going to be problematic. We're going to see, and we already are seeing, the number of school-age kids decrease. So what a wonderful talk by Rabbi, but I think we probably have not heeded the advice of go forth and multiply. We seem to be subtracting at this point. So this is an issue, right? Now, it's an issue nationally. The National Center for Education Statistics has noted this as well and has projected, again, out to 2029, 2030, where the number of students in elementary and secondary schools is going to continue to grow. For those of us, and for those of you that have been involved with opening up schools, you already know this, right? You know that it's become harder and harder to start to capture students. This is data from Maricopa County, where more than half of our schools are located. And if you look at the 2023 age breakdown, look at how many kids we have in ages 1, 2, 3, and 4 compared to the 15, 16, 17, 18-year-olds. Now, this is an issue, right? Because at some point, these are the students that are going to matriculate into our schools. So again, even locally, we're going to start to see these problems. Ohio's not immune from this. Also from the National Center for Education Statistics, we see a declining student enrollments in Ohio's schools. And they've projected something like a 10% loss as we move through the current time, and an additional 5% loss as we move forward. So why is that an issue? And how does that play with my optimism of the growth of classical education and the numbers put out by Arcadia Education? So I still think that classical education is going to increase, but I think it's going to become harder. The environment is going to become a lot more competitive. If you go back to some of that historical data and the live birth data, you start to see as the school-age population was increasing, that occurred during, at least for Great Hearts, during that time of really expansive growth. And as the population starts decreasing, you see a leveling off of the growth. We're still growing, but not nearly as fast as we were. And we have found we don't have trouble filling the schools, but we do have more trouble than we used to. The wait lists are, in fact, shorter as we start to move forward. Anybody who's been in business for a while recognizes this principle, right? It's easier to convince new customers than it is to convert existing customers away from their, what they're used to. That's particularly true in schools, right? That's why the kindergarten numbers are so important. Again, for those that have opened schools, that's often one of the easiest grades to recruit in, because once families get established in a school, they're just less likely to start to depart from that. So even though I am hopeful about the growth of classical education, I do think we need to take these numbers seriously. I think there's a reason why schools that have opened in the past 5 years have had a harder time gaining traction in some of the communities than we were seeing, say, 15 years ago. Okay, that's the most stats that I'm going to do today, even though I'm a math guy, right? This next one is near and dear to my heart. Because I am hopeful, because I think that Arcadia is not only right, but maybe even underestimating the growth, I think we're going to get to the point where we're going to have 10% of the students, 15% of the students in this country in classical education. And the challenge with that is, and it's a good challenge, is that as that happens, the population in classical schools is going to start to mirror the average population of the country. Right? This is just the law of big numbers, right? The more of the, I hate to think of students as a market, but the more of the market that classical education captures, the more that market is going to start to resemble the general population. And the problem with that now is that that's not true now, right? So for those running schools, I would ask you to compare your numbers to this. The average number of students that are economically disadvantaged or on free and reduced lunch in the country hovers around 50%. I think in Ohio it's higher than that. Paul would probably have the better numbers. But it tends to hover right around there. And the average number of students in special education is around 15%. And again, at least some of the numbers I was looking at in Ohio are just a little bit above that. This is not to say there are not classical schools that mirror this. We run a school in Maryvale, Arizona, Maryvale, an area of Phoenix, that has 90% FRL. So this is not to suggest that this is non-existent in classical schools. But again, I bet if we did a raise of hands among those here who are running schools, most of them are falling below this, right? Now again, this is a good thing, because I fundamentally believe, along with Mortimer Adler, who is responsible for the Great Books Renaissance at the University of Chicago, that the best education is the best education for everybody. I am an evangelist for classical education. I don't think that it is the property of wealthy families who can afford tuition. I think this is the education that will save our country. I think this is the education that will pass on the tradition that gave birth to the education itself. And I think it is for everybody. And I think the challenge, and it's a good one, for existing classical schools is as their populations start to get more economically disadvantaged students, more students who are on an IEP, it's going to force them to reckon with what that means. And that is a challenge. So for schools that have seen a shift in that type of demographic, you already know this. We have the good work of people like Dr. Anika Prather, who's talking about how to bring the model of classical education to a variety of communities. And we have some amazing new work by Amy Richards about what this means to do classical education with a special education student. But these are generally kind of works of philosophy, they're works of evangelization. But what we really need is people who know what they're doing. People who are committed that this education is the best education for every student, and therefore are committed to figuring out what that means for the student who's economically disadvantaged, who has very little parent support at home, for the student that's on an IEP, and dare I say it, even for the student who has Down syndrome. And this is a passionate thing for me, because my older brother has Down syndrome. And in one of our schools, we have Wesley Jackson, who just graduated from the school that my kids are at. And Wesley Jackson also has Down syndrome and made it all the way through our program with all the necessary accommodations, but one could never say that he did not get the same education that everyone else did. So that even in the last day, he was able to give a senior thesis defense. As he read his 3 books, as he wrote a paper about it, that was, of course, of a different nature than the rest of the other students. But it wasn't so different. And he stood up, and he defended his paper, and he answered questions. And in that room, it was standing room only. I felt bad for the 2 defenses that flanked it. Usually there's a lot of students, a lot of faculty, a lot of parents in these defenses, and you couldn't get in the room for Wesley's defense. We have got to take this seriously. We cannot simply say this education is for everybody if we're willing to discount the 15% on IEPs and the 50% who are economically disadvantaged. So it's a challenge, but it's a good challenge, and it's coming. as the movement grows, it will bring, just mathematically speaking, it will bring this challenge with us. Number 3, and this is probably the most felt in the schools, that the growth of classical schools is outpacing the increase in qualified instructors, and this is exacerbated at the leadership level. When there's a lot of times people will call your schools, if they've been around for a while, they'll call your schools for help, they'll call us, and I'm sure that you get the same questions. Can you help us find a leader? Can you help us find more qualified teachers, right? So I have some hope, right, that as students matriculate through these programs, those programs themselves start to produce teachers who are now formed in the tradition and qualified for this. The challenge right now is that it is a growing movement, right? So if you think of sort of the rest of education, public or private, it's kind of been stable for a while, and as we've now seen, a little bit decreasing. And even though there are teaching shortages around the country, that system is generating its own teachers. The good problem with the classical education movement is it's growing. And as it's growing, it needs to just per capita of students, how many teachers are you producing? It needs to generate more than the rest of education because it's one of the few areas in education that are growing. So why is this hard and why is it such a big deal? So I want to focus on the profile of the classical teacher with a painting from Norman wrong Rockwell painting. Oh, yeah, I'm really sorry. I love Norman Rockwell, and I'm sure this is a wildly inappropriate thing, but my favorite part of this painting is the young lady who's and then this dude over here. Just so funny. But we'll move past that. Here's why it's hard. We demand in our classrooms a standard that is not only deeper, but I would say just even broader than what's happening in other types of schools. And it's critical that this happens because we understand that education has as its end the formation of the human person. Now I want to pause on that point for a minute. When I say education has as its end the formation of the human person, that is not Jake Tawney's opinion. That is not the opinion of classical education. That is a truism about all education. I don't care what school you're at, whether it's a classical school, whether it's a public school, a Jewish school, a Christian school. Anytime we educate, we are forming human souls. Period. The difference is, and again, I'm not saying classical education is alone in this, but I am saying it is a marked difference, is that we understand that and we take that seriously. In other words, the unique thing that I think classical education brings to the table is the recognition that if we are forming souls, then we better get it right. And the reality is, you cannot give what you do not have, and you cannot teach except from who you are. Which means the most important decision that we make is that teacher that we put in front of those young souls. Because it is never merely about content acquisition. It is about the formation of the soul. The teacher has more in common with the master builders of old than she does with a modern data scientist. Now, I want to qualify that, right? You certainly won't find me opposed to student achievement data. I mean, after all, every time a teacher gives a test or a quiz, they're collecting, they better be, collecting data on how well the kids are understanding the stuff that they're trying to teach. But I am saying that image of a teacher who's just scrutinizing over numbers, looking for deep trends, that is not the image of a teacher that we have in our schools. The image of the teacher we have is the soul crafter. Whereas the master builders of old were crafting the beautiful cathedrals, the teachers are helping their students to become more alive. Intellectually, aesthetically, and morally alive. They are crafting souls. Now, to be clear, there are at least two other people in the lives of students that are also soul crafters. And here I think of pastors and parents. And so it is worth pausing on why a teacher is distinct from a pastor and a parent. And the reason, the fundamental distinction, is that the teacher forms the souls through the content and through the act of teaching. Which means not only do we have to take that teacher's character seriously, not only do we have to take their ability to form souls seriously, but they also have to be masters of the content and masters of the craft of teaching. So that's the second requirement that we have. But the third requirement, in order to do all of that, is somehow we demand a formation that's even bigger than just their math degree. That somehow the ideal master teacher in a classical school has been formed by the very tradition that they are passing on. So we need them formed well in the tradition, absolute experts in the content and the teaching techniques that are given to them, and we need them to be of good character. This is why it's hard to recruit teachers, and why it gets even harder to recruit the leaders who've been through the teaching, who understand that we still use the term headmaster, but that school leader is the head of the master teachers. And the master teacher is the head over the newer teachers. That teaching itself is a guild, and it's a guild that is led by that school leader. This is why this is difficult. Right? And we feel this. You all, if you see heads nodding, like you feel this in the schools. It's hard to find the leaders. And again, just maybe to summarize that piece, there's really no replacement for the Andrew Zorneman, who now leads the Cana Academy Training Institute and is doing the History 250 videos, which are wonderful. But Andrew Zorneman went through this kind of education, became a teacher in this kind of education, and then became a headmaster in this kind of education. And there's no replacement for that kind of formation. There's no replacement for the formation my colleague Geraldine Olson has, who went from kindergarten all the way up and received this kind of education, and then can bring that to our students and now our teachers. So it's a challenge. Now, it would be helpful, though, if we didn't sort of lose by our own rules in this. This is already going to be a challenge, right? Until we see a real takeoff, and then there'll be a lag, because kids have to go to college, decide to teach, get into the schools. But until we see a real takeoff, this is already going to be a challenge to recruit teachers and recruit school leaders. But let's not lose by our own rules. We have got to deal with the challenge of required state credentials. Now, I recognize this will be audacious. It might even be scandalous to some people. But there is a growing body of research that says there's very little correlation between the state teacher requirements for credentialing and the quality of teaching of the teachers that are coming out, right? There's a growing body of research on this. In fact, some of the research is now saying that kind of credentialing is actually weeding out a good amount of people who love and know their discipline and have characteristics that we recognize for good teaching, right? So we've got to do something about this. We've got to do something where we can allow for an easier path into the teaching vocation. Number two, if we're going to do that, that means some kind of reform of the undergraduate level. So I am a massive fan of the graduate programs, a massive fan. Our experience, though, with the graduate programs is that they provide a nice recruiting technique for us. Say, hey, come here and teach, and then we can help you with this graduate program in classical education. So it helps a little bit with recruiting. It helps a decent amount more with retention, but it does not solve, in not any significant way, the teaching shortage. And that is because most of the people that we're going to be recruiting are coming out of that undergraduate level. And so we have to find a way of reforming schools of education within universities to support and promote this kind of training, this kind of formation. We really do need more schools that have people like Dan Copeland at Hillsdale and others who worked with him to say, yeah, we're not going to have this pocket of classical education. Our entire formation, our school of education, is going to be towards this kind of thing. I'm right, Katie, right? Very good. She's nodding. Good. We need more schools to do that. Now, if I said something audacious about teacher credentialing, let me upset like the other half of the crowd, right? I am not ready to abandon schools of education. I'm not. When a tremendous amount of our teachers are coming through those programs, I'm not ready to abandon that. I'm especially not ready to abandon them at public universities. I had a good opportunity to see a speaker talk about education generally, but made this point that in a nation that is founded on the serious principle of self-governance, it's really important that the people take seriously their own self-governance. How do we vote? What can be done through legislation? Especially at the public universities, these are the universities that are funded by our own tax dollars and our own votes. We're literally sitting at an event put on by a new center that has been supported by a change in state legislation. I'm not ready to give up on schools of education. That's hard work. I'm also not naive. I went through those schools. I'm not naive about this. But I'm not ready to abandon it when so many teachers are coming through those programs. Think of how this kind of movement could take off if we started having programs within places like Ohio State that were saying, like, this kind of education, this kind of pedagogy, this kind of training, this kind of formation is going to be the core of what we do in our program of education. I don't think that it's hard, but I don't think that's impossible. Okay. The final challenge, which is really what I want to spend a good bit of my time on, and if the first three challenges are in some ways challenges from kind of without, at least it's not a perfect analogy, but kind of without, right? The school age number of children is declining. The free and reduced lunch percentages and special education percentages are going to start looking like the national averages as the movement grows. The growth of classical schools is outpacing the growth of qualified teachers. There's sort of a problem within, and it might be the one that I'm mostly worried about. It's the challenge of defining classical education itself. And I think, so it's really interesting, when we do our new faculty orientation, about 10 years ago, we never really bothered to define what classical education was for them. And one of the reasons why is people did not come to us knowing that term. So all we did was sort of describe our educational model without having to back up and give a nice bullet point list of what classical education is. What we're finding, 10 years in, what we're finding is that people are coming to us knowing that term, maybe even coming to us because of that term, and they still have no idea what it is, right? I've had this dialogue with friends who are in fact education professors who say, look, I can get on board with this classical education. What is it? I keep asking people what it is, and I don't get a coherent answer. And I want to just say, I own that. We all should own that. We all should be able to dialogue about what this thing is. Now, this does not mean necessarily an elevator pitch, right? While I appreciate the need for the 2-minute bit, the problem with classical education is twofold, or defining it, right? One is there is no elevator pitch for it. Any elevator pitch will fall short. It's kind of in the nature of the education itself that it's about deep thought and getting at reality. And so why would we think we would get at the deep thought and reality of education itself through a pithy statement? So that's one problem. The second problem is that there are disagreements, and that's good. The problem right now with defining classical education is that we're actually seeing two extremes, and I'm worried about both of them. On the one hand, it seems like classical education is becoming the thing to do, and because nobody knows what it is, as long as you stick your kids in uniforms and they walk in lines in the hallways, you say we're a classical school. Like, we kind of laugh, but folks, I've seen it, right? And so that's one extreme, and I'm very worried about that. I'm worried that as the word starts to become used more broadly, that it gets co-opted into generality, or worse, co-opted into something that it just doesn't stand for because of that generality. So I think we need to do better than that. The other problem, however, is that the other side of this debate often wants to say, look, my school has this model of classical education. This is how we do it. And if you do anything different than that, anathema. It's like such a rigid definition that that also is not helpful. There are right and good debates within classical education, right? Do you sequence your elementary history classes starting with ancient, moving to medieval, so that kids get a sense of the continuous timeline? Or do you adopt an approach that does a little bit of each year because developmentally you don't want to regulate ancient Greece down to just kindergarten? Those are great debates. You don't talk for a half an hour, ask me about Singapore math and Saxon. Like, that's a great debate. There are differences within the movement, and that is good. Some of you may know, does anybody know of O'Sullivan's principle in business? So this is the principle that says any organization that does not set out intentionally and repeatedly to be conservative will drift liberal over time. This is, in some ways, the analogy here is if the classical movement does not set its sights on really trying to define what it is, it will drift towards ambiguity, right? But I have an opposite principle, which says that any organization that repeatedly and intentionally sets out to be conservative over time will destroy itself through internecine wars. And I think it's kind of true. And so that's the other side of this coin with defining classical education. We can't be so rigid as to say, guys, if you're not, like, if you ever lecture to a kid, like, you're ruining their soul. Like, hey, we should talk about that, but we can't be that rigid. But again, all jokes aside, we also can't say as long as kids are in uniforms and walking in straight lines in the hallway that you can call yourselves a classical school. So I think this is a problem. I think that this is why I said optimistic and pessimistic. I'm very optimistic about the Arcadia numbers. I think actually we're going to do better than that. What I am a little bit worried about is that as it grows, what is the thing that's growing? Is it just that they've called themselves a classical school? What is the thing that's growing? So what I'd like to do, and just to spend really kind of the next 15 minutes or so, is to at least start that dialogue. I'd like to talk a little bit about what this is. So what I've tried to do is to outline principles that I think all classical schools will adhere to. This is not meant to be a perfect definition. There are other things we should be talking about. The place of Latin in a curriculum. Where is that? When should it be? But I think these are pretty good starting points for a definitional structure. So number one, classical education is an education in the great conversation. It is an education is the best that's been said, the best that's been written, painted, sung, solved, and discovered. It is adhering to that Adlerian principle that the best education, the best that's been done, is really the best for everybody. We want students to have exposure to real truth and real goodness and real beauty. And that kind of thing has been spoken on, as Chesterton says, by the democracy of the dead. This is not to suggest, by the way, that new great works can't be written now. They can. It's just that we think in our schools a certain passing of time needs to happen before the democracy of the dead can speak. And so this principle reminds us not only that students deserve the best, but they deserve to converse with the best. That they are being plunged into conversation with Dickens and Dostoevsky, Austen and Aristotle, with Charlotte's Web, with the fairy tales, with Euclid, with Newton. It's an education in the great conversation of human history. Number two, classical education is the formation of students in truth, goodness, and beauty. Now, this is the one that particularly risks becoming a bumper sticker, right? We see truth, goodness, and beauty plastered on virtually every classical school that we walk into, our own and others, right? We must never forget that this is a real principle. That in studying the things that are in the class, they all point to truth, goodness, and beauty. That these are the transcendentals. These are the things that we go after that form the students. This is the formation of the soul. And it's not just the objectiveness of truth, but it's also goodness and beauty, right? A world that has very quickly relativized beauty as only in the eye of the beholder, right? The rabbi mentioned that, but then moves on to relativizing goodness, is now at the risk of relativizing truth itself. All three of these things are objective realities, and students deserve to be not only exposed to them and to develop a palate for them, but to allow those works to form them. Each of the disciplines, by the way, points to all of these things, but I do think there's a way in which some of the disciplines go after one of them most immediately. So I think it seems pretty obvious to me that the arts go after beauty first. And through beauty, they communicate truth and they communicate goodness. math seems to communicate truth first. Right? Here's my argument for why math is at least one of the most important things that students study. In mathematics class, students are learning that there is objective reality in a way that is far more obvious than the other disciplines. This is not to say that in something like literature, when you're looking at the question of whether Robin Hood is a protagonist or an antagonist, I'm not saying that's relative, but I am saying it's difficult. But when a student learns the Pythagorean theorem, they are learning something that is true before they were born, will be true long after they are dead, so that someday that student can have it written on your tombstone. This person knew the Pythagorean theorem. Which means not only are students learning objective reality, but they're also learning that some objective reality is eternal. Not all things that are objectively true are eternal, right? My reading glasses have a prescription of 1.25. I assure you that is not eternally objective. I can already feel my eyes getting weaker as I get old, right? But in math, we're learning things that are objectively true and eternally true. But it's more than that. Because we're actually learning that there's objective truth in things not made of matter. Because no matter how much you think you've seen a real triangle, you haven't. No true perfect triangle exists in the material world. When we study the objects of math, we're studying the objects of the heavens. And yeah, the created world does seem to be designed in a way that speaks the language of mathematics, which is all just to prove my point, that math is the discipline that uniquely bridges heaven and earth. This is why we teach math, by the way. It's not because it's useful. Math is useful and that's beautiful, but we teach math because there's something unique in the human soul that can only be satisfied by thinking mathematically. I think I went on a little long about math. Let's move. Literature seems to point to goodness. This is where students learn what it means to be human. That's what gives literature its enduring quality, by the way. That, together with its artistic merit, right? That students learn something enduring about the human condition by studying great works of literature. And this is why a classical school is fundamentally about formation and virtue. But I do want to point out, the best place that the most effective way students learn virtuous behavior is through the curriculum. People often ask us, what is our character education program? Like Great Hearts, you talk a lot about virtue, you talk a lot about character formation. Like what is your character formation program? And we just hand them our reading list. Because that's really primarily where students learn what it means to be human, right? So truth, goodness, and beauty need to be connected, dare I say it, to the very smallest things by the teacher. The formation of the perfect A in handwriting class. The slope-intercept form of the line. The conjugations in Latin. Everything needs to be eventually connected all the way up to truth, goodness, and beauty. I don't mean in an obnoxious, sort of obvious way. Like today, kids, we're going to have on the left side of the board the learning objective, and then we're going to show how it's connected to truth, goodness, and beauty. No, you don't talk about it, you just do it. You just do it. Classical education is a study of real things. It's not the study of opinions. It's the study of reality itself. Whether it's history, where we teach simply what happened, without lens. What happened? What were the ramifications? Why did it happen? Whether it's the study of math and the real objects, whether it's the study of the human condition, the nature of virtue itself through literature, we're studying real things. We call this sometimes philosophical realism, right? It's trying to plunge students into an encounter with things that are real, because that's where awe and wonder comes from. It always does. Awe and wonder always comes from a true encounter. We think of it most obviously with beauty, right? When we stand in front of a painting and we have just this amazing awe and wonder about it. But what's happening there is you're actually encountering the reality itself. So classical education understands that what we're doing is simply teaching reality. This is a big one. That classical ed understands that content and pedagogy are inseparable. Every school has a curriculum, classical or not. So they have some level of intentionality over the stuff they're giving to kids. Even if part of their philosophy of curriculum is, let's change it every 1 to 2 years to see if something else is working better, that's at least an intentional decision So the fact that classical ed has an intentional content, an intentional program of study is not altogether unique. The nuances of what those are pretty unique. But what really makes it unique is its connection with pedagogy. That we understand there are tried and tested techniques that work. And this is why it's so hard to form and train teachers. Because we want tried and tested techniques. And the reason those are important are not simply for effectiveness. Like, we teach a phonics-based program not simply because phonics has now been proven to be the most effective way to teach all students to read. The myth of whole language is dead. That's not the main reason why we use phonics, though. The main reason that we teach phonics is because it shows students that language is ordered and knowable. That even in its exceptions, it has order. We give students physical things in math class early on, not just because modern education research now says if you start with manipulatives and the things closest, it's the easiest way to get kids to abstract towards mathematical truth. That's true, and that's amazing, and that's the second reason why we do it. We do it because it teaches students philosophically that math is grounded in the real, that it's not a bunch of tips and tricks made up by mathematicians for job security. We have students do the seminar method around the great books, not just because that's an effective way to get them to encounter and understand what Aristotle's trying to say, but primarily because it teaches them that truth is communal, that we learn together in a community through civic dialogue. So the pedagogies are as important as the content because they are as formational as the content. They are tried and tested, and so they are effective, but they are effective not only at content and skill acquisition, but also effective at the formation of the soul. Next one, classical education has an inherent focus on the Western tradition. This is unapologetic. This does not mean that we worship the West. This does not mean that we say that there's never been atrocities in the West. That's just completely obviously false. There have been tremendous atrocities in the West. But we do know that the classical education has a Western intellectual heritage that is the rightful inheritance of all the students sitting here in Columbus, in the state of Ohio, in the United States as Westerners. No matter what your background is, we are all Westerners by virtue of where we are living. But I think it's more than that. I think it's not just that classical ed fills its content with Western education, but classical education itself is a product of the West. It came out of this tradition. So there's this delightful give back that happens. Whereas the Western tradition gives birth to classical education, and classical education then becomes the mechanism for handing on the tradition of the West. This principle also, by the way, reminds us that even though education is the formation of the human soul, and each human soul has an individual and infinite dignity, education is more than that. It's also about the people. It's also about passing on a heritage. At the very least, an intellectual heritage. But certainly we also mean an artistic heritage, a moral heritage. Classical education holds pride of pace for language as a fundamental mode of learning. If the myth of whole languages is dead, the myth of learning styles is dying. Most of the evidence coming out now says, yeah, you need language and you need visuals, and everybody needs that. Multiple representations are really helpful for students. But we also understand that language is fundamental to what it means to be human. The human being is what? The rational animal, right? That's what sets us apart from the other animals. But one of the ways that our rationality is both disclosed, and I would say even to some degree encapsulated, is through the use of language itself. All teachers are professional orators. They teach through language. We want students to be able to speak intelligently and to write intelligently. And then finally, classical education is an education in the liberal arts. There's a whole other lecture that we probably should do on the difference between those two traditions and the classical education movement that's come up sort of through homeschooling, through small Christian schools, but then also like Mortimer Adler and the liberal arts that are starting to push down. And what we're seeing now in the schools is sort of a confluence of all of this, right? The rabbi mentioned the 7 of them. I don't think he named them. We have a brave soul who knows the 7 liberal arts. So we have trivium of grammar, logic, rhetoric. Quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy. Very good. And what we have here is the 3 and the 4. We have the arts of language and we have the arts of number. And if you know something about the symbolism of number, 3 always represents something of the eternal. And this is because language itself is eternal. Now, it's significant, by the way, I'll just say a little bit about this. The grammar and logic end in the study of rhetoric. That's actually interesting, right? If the purpose of language is to get at truth, why does it not stop at logic? Like, we use grammar to form coherent sentences. We use logic to take sentences to make coherent arguments. At that point, we know truth. Why does it continue on through rhetoric? And the answer is because truth itself is effusive. Once you've discovered it, it demands to be shared. Indeed, you have a moral obligation to share it, the truth that you've discovered. This is the end of the Meno, right? Go off and convince others of that which you've been convinced. This is also, by the way, why we have students show work. So little 3rd grade Johnny wants to know why he needs to show his work on a math problem. It's not because we don't want him doing it in his head. If little 3rd grade Johnny did the math problem in his head, our response should be, well done, my good and faithful mathematician. Now write it down for all posterity so that people after you can see the truth that you have discovered, and please do it in great handwriting. That's why we show our work. Right, now you have the arts of language over here. I'll also say something audacious just to make my colleague happy. Grammar is not the property of elementary school only. Grammar should be taught from kindergarten all the way up through 12th grade. Right, thanks for the laugh. Grammar should be taught all the way up through high school. It turns out there's more grammar beyond nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs and pronouns. Right? There are beautiful constructs of grammar that need to be taught. On the side of the 4, you have the arts of number. And that may strike the ear odd, right? Because I see arithmetic and geometry, which are obviously math. But for the ancients, astronomy was not the chemical makeup of stars and kind of how we think of modern astronomy. Astronomy for the ancients was the movement of the heavenly bodies. So it literally was geometry in motion. It was a branch of math. And music was number in relationship to itself. Those of you that play a stringed instrument probably know this, that you cut a string in half, you get musical intervals, predictable musical intervals. So for the ancients, music also was the study of number. And this tells us something, I think, about language itself, that we have sort of word and we have number. And those are the 2 fundamental things in the universe, and everything else comes from that. And so we understand the place of the liberal arts within a classical education. Okay, let me wrap up just with this. If I started with challenges for the movements, with great humility, I want to issue a couple of challenges to the movement. Number 1, in the spirit of trying to define this thing and avoiding the extremes, the definition that's too loose to be helpful and the one that's too rigid to not die. There should be a coordinated advertising campaign that both defines and communicates the nature and importance of classical education to all students. As more people come to know this, we need more people to know this, and that includes knowing this, knowing the thing. And so being able to rally around some definition that says, for all the differences that we find from one school to the next, here are the points. Here's what it means. Number 2, we must push forward with regulatory environments that support school choice. I'm a huge fan of the combination of competition and accountability. I think we get better schools when we have competition and accountability. And this includes, very boldly, equal funding models. We must take seriously the question of teacher credentials. So I already talked about that. And I talked about not giving up on schools of education. But I'm also going to say something else audacious. We cannot give up on the traditional district schools. We are a nation that's founded on the principle of self-governance. And especially if you put the magnet schools back in the percentages with traditional district schools, you get 80%. 80% of our populace is coming through the district schools. I'm not ready to give up on that. How powerful would it be if a single district said, we're going to go down this classical route. We're going to rediscover our roots that were there 100 years ago. It's not foreign to public education. It's just been abandoned largely. We're seeing this happen, and I recognize the difference. I really do. I'm not naive. But we're seeing this happen in dioceses, entire dioceses in the Catholic Church saying we're going to move all the schools to a classical model. How powerful would it be if a voting public started to put people on school boards that started to move that school in the direction of classical education? That's the next step. That's how this growth moves from that 4.8% to something bigger. Again, I'll just repeat the principle. We are a nation built on self-governance. We need to take seriously the prospect of self-governing. So this has always been my challenge to people who are involved in charter schools, private schools, homeschooling. You should also get on school boards. There are schools, after all. Okay, now let me just wrap up here and I'll take questions. I just want to return to this slide because this is something I believe in. But I believe in this not just for our students. One of the things we tell our teachers all the time is that classical education is for you as much as it is for them. So maybe some of you are sitting here, you had a classical education from kindergarten all the way through college. Maybe some of you only went to something like a high school that had this model. Maybe some didn't see it until college. Maybe some of you are like me, where I never heard of the term or never really experienced it until we started homeschooling, well after college. Maybe for some of you, you're sitting here and just have no background in classical education. All of that's okay. But if you look at the reason, if you look at what it is, it should convince you that it's for you as much as it is for the students. So if you have never read Charlotte's Web, you should. If you have never read, well, let's take something you have access to, Plato's Apology, you should. If you've never done a Euclid proof, you should. If you've never painted or drawn or sung or acted, you should. Because this is about your formation as much as it is about the students. For those of you involved in schools, you cannot give what you do not have, you cannot teach, and you cannot lead except from who you are. And so my charge to you is to find that great awe and wonder of the tradition itself. And remember that wonder is a choice in its normative way. Look, I'm live in Arizona now, from Ohio, live in Arizona, but I have the Grand Canyon moments. I get that. I understand what it means to feel like wonder happens to you. But the normative way that wonder works is that it's a choice. We choose to wonder about something. It's like love in that way. Love is also a choice, right? I love my wife insofar as I wake up every morning and decide to love her. And love and wonder are related, right? I love my wife insofar as I stand in great awe and wonder of her. And I know she feels the same about me because she says all the time, Jake, I often wonder about you. This is a noble charge. It is the most noble of all charges. This is our mission. This is what we do. And we should not rest until every student in this country is getting this kind of education. And if we can do that, we can be heroes, as Edna St. Vincent Millay says in her poem, reaching up for the gods, pulling down these truths, and handing them to our students. And that seems like a pretty good way to spend our time. Thank you so much. While questions are coming, I see Dr. O'Toole up here. Do note, I also put cards for our own classical symposium that happens in February. We run this national conference for classical education in Phoenix in February. I mean, come on, right? And it is the single largest gathering that's not specifically sectarian, right? So it's a pretty big tent of classical educators that come to us, and we'll get about 900 people from around the country come to this. So you're all, of course, more than invited. Dr. O'Toole.
Thanks, Jake. That was a great talk. I appreciated your thoughts on the growth of the classical world and the challenges that we face. I want to talk to you about this definition of classical education here. One of the challenges for the movement you noted is there's no agreed upon definition of classical ed. And you cited the danger that we will fail to move forward without clarity. And I agree with you about that danger. I'm sitting here and I'm looking at two things. I'm looking at what is classical education, and then I'm looking at a banner that says education for citizenship. And I note that in your definition, you spoke about the Western tradition, but I didn't hear anything about America. And so I wonder if you could explain if you see a connection between the education that we provide in classical schools and the education for citizenship that we hope for here at the Chase Center.
Yeah, I do. It's a great question. When we go through some of these principles with our teachers, obviously we spend, this slide is the, hour-long talk for teachers. And so we go into a good bit of detail. And then we start stepping through the disciplines themselves. And when we talk about the Western tradition, we make the point that, especially in the study of history, but also of civics, that there's this basic principle that you start with what's closest to you, right? So I emphasize the West broadly, but there's no doubt, and I think this is true for classical education in America, that there's also a focus on the American tradition, right? In the same way, why there's a focus on the Western tradition for all of classical education. But there's no doubt that the classical curriculum, the pieces that go into it, are going to look different for an American classical school as they are for, say, a Polish classical school, right? And so usually that's where we start to dig into that, Dr. O'Toole. But I heard two things in there. I heard America, and I think that's spot on. It's exactly right. Understanding that not only are we Westerners, but that we are the particular Westerners that are Americans, that kind of history and that kind of civics does have a pride of place in the content itself. So I think that's right. I heard also something then about, is the purpose of education the education for citizenship itself? Yes, and I think there's a very short, solid line from the formation, the passing on of a tradition, the formation of the human soul, and then what that means to have that kind of formation educated for all of our citizens, right? So I think there's a very short, solid line from formation of the soul into citizenship. I will say, maybe just specifically, the citizenship question is one that we do need to take seriously, right? Dr. Strang said that maybe like 5% of students coming into law school had read the Constitution, right? So that's like the very base level of the problem. But it is astonishing to me in a lot of political debates right now. Maybe you've seen this, maybe you haven't, but it seems that like wherever people are on the political spectrum, the one thing they seem to be able to agree upon is, if I want something done, the President of the United States should do it. Like that seems to be the common premise in all of the debates, right? So you get these presidential debates, and they're asked just like absurd questions of things that they just shouldn't be doing at all. And I think what has happened, and we all know this, is that the general American public has no sense of the balance of powers between the branches and the balance of powers between the federal and the state. Those civic principles are fundamentally important, right? And so I think that is exactly right. I do think that education is about the formation of a people. In some ways, I didn't directly say it, to be fair, but that's kind of the point that I was making in saying that, look, we do need to be careful in thinking that education is only about the individual human soul and its formation, right? It is also about the formation of a people and the passing on of a tradition to a people. And in order to be an effective citizen, you need a tradition that is grounded in all of this stuff, but particularly in the civic principles of the country. Good?
Thank you very much. Over the years, I've had I won't call it an opportunity, but as an authorizer of charter schools, we've had to close schools that have, for a variety of reasons, not succeeded. And one of the things we did in many of these schools is we would sit down with parents, students, after the school closed, to help them find another school, whether it was a private school, public school, charter school, whatever. The common question that we would get from parents and from students, these are in high poverty, high minority neighborhoods. These are kids that are families that are often challenged in many ways. And so what they're asking us as we sit down and say, we want to help you find another school. Question comes up, do they provide transportation? Mm-hmm. Do they offer technology? Do they offer lunch and breakfast and after school care? And so we answer those questions, and then we try and get to the curriculum or to the mission of the school, and they could care less about that, to be perfectly honest with you. So here's my question. The challenge is with classical education, how do we get classical education out there to folks that it's not on the radar screen? It's not in that consideration of food and transportation and childcare for people that are in those situations. There's often a perception that classical education is great if your parents went to college. Yep. And if you didn't, this is just too much for me to gather. So that's my, and if I can ask you just to supplement that, one of the questions I've gotten is, as I talk about our involvement with classical education, well, they don't use technology. Technology is changing, and they're still back in the dark ages reading books, and of course I don't agree with that. But could you address those two areas? How do we go after that market share, those folks that need this, but are often intimidated by it or don't have any knowledge of it? And then second, where does this perception about technology fit in with classical education?
I mean, both those are large questions, and so let me do my best to at least start the conversation about that. The first question, you know, when parents are concerned about transportation and food and all of this, how do we even begin to speak to them about this amazing curriculum, this amazing model that we have? The first answer is you have to address the problems of transportation and food, right? I mean, we should, as an educational community, be able to start to address that, right? The districts address this. I think the charter schools needed to address it. Obviously, that requires, you know, depends on the state you're in, but it requires legislative action in many ways, funding for these sorts of things. But I think, at least for me, that goes without saying. Like you have to address those things that the parents are concerned with, right? There's sort of another step that I kind of heard in that question, which is they're worried about this, but they don't know about this thing at all. And so how do we make that more obvious? Again, I think that gets back to one of my charges, which is there has to be a better campaign for this kind of thing, to make sure that people know about it. Now, I do think that there is a sort of a sense of market saturation, right? I read this somewhere, but I don't have the reference. It's like once you get to about 10 to 12%, then it becomes a lot more people tend to know about the thing, even if they're not in the thing. And so if we're sitting here with the Arcadia numbers at 2.5, if I'm optimistically saying I think we can get to 5, you probably need to be at about 10 to 12% market penetration before more people are just fully aware of what the thing is. And so I think that will help. That's not a perfect answer, but again, I would vehemently defend my first answer to this. You've got to address those basic needs, or you're just not going to have any hope of keeping that student. The question of technology is one that needs to be taken seriously. I can give you my own opinions on this. You know, I think that it should be used very, very rarely and very intentionally. And it depends what we mean by technology, right? I'm not making a joke here, but of course we have dot cams in our schools, right? And that's a technology. Of course, the most important technology ever developed probably was the book. We have that too. But usually when people mean technology, they mean the screen, right? They mean an iPad, they mean a computer. Again, I'll just be bold here and say what I think, but I think this is a conversation that classical educators need to have. I think that it is so much more often misused than it is used, and so I don't think in many cases it's necessary, and I mean that in two ways. It's not necessary to do the things we want to do, but it's also not necessary to give the parents and students the thing they want. Like, they will naturally get that anyway, right? This is the old joke, is that the kids understand the technology better than the teachers. Of course they do. Right? That's, again, not a perfect answer. I think that conversation needs to happen. I think at the very least, the foundation of that conversation needs to be on, again, a teleological approach. What are we trying to do? What is the end of this? What kind of graduate are we trying to help a student become? What is the purpose of education? And back up and say, to what degree is this happening? There's a real danger in me going off on this question. Let me just mention one more point about this. Oftentimes, just like teaching techniques are defended only in terms of effectiveness, technology is as well. I do want to point out the obvious reality, along with Neil Postman, right, from the writing in the 80s on the heels of the television culture, that all technology forms not by its misuse, but by its use. It's like we should as a culture take that seriously too, right? The watch has not given us the ability to keep time so much as it has turned us into a time-keeping people. And so if that's true, if the use of technology is forming us, that should also be the base of the conversation. How is a particular technology, a particular use, forming the human person to understand what the human person is, right? All the conversations around ChatGPT right now seem to be about essay writing and cheating, and can you use it in a good way, and can you use it? No one's having the conversation about, is this confusing students on the nature of what it means to be human? I think it might be, or at least it's in a nascent form that could grow up into something that's doing that. And I'm worried about that. So I don't know what our time is. I'm not in charge. We got We're out of time. I will be around at lunch. I'd love to chat more about this. Thank you so much for your time, everybody. I'm very humbled to be here. I don't have all the answers. I have some thoughts. I have more questions than I have thoughts. So let's chat at lunch. Let's get to know one another, and let's continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jake.